Hi, hello everyone. I'm Joseph from thanks to Stephanie's invitation that I will do a very brief introduction of myself. So I work in a hotel called Eaton, Hong Kong. I think why Stephanie invited me because 2 years ago I did a show with Riar and Natasha in our hotel's gallery called New Pessimism Tropical Frontier, which is the first solo show under the New Pessimism framework. So I would start with introduce Natasha and Riar and just read their bio to you. Yeah. So Natasha Tontey is a Minahasan artist based between Jakarta and Yogyakarta, Indonesia. Her practice predominantly explore the fictional account of history and myths surrounding manufactured fear. In her practice, she observed any possibility of other future that are projected not from the perspective of major and established institutions, but a subtle and personal struggle of the outcast entities and being. Her recent exhibition, including solo show, is now on in the Macaque Museum. She also have a solo in Auto Italia in London and other group show in Singapore International Film Festival, Singapore Biennale, and goes 2565, and etc. So Riar Rizaldi is an artist and filmmaker working across both cinema and exhibition contexts, and his artistic practice focus mostly on the relationship between technology, labor, and nature, worldview, genre, cinema, and the possibility of theatrical fiction. His work has been shown at the International Berlin Film Festival, International Film Festival Rotterdam, Venice Architectural Biennale, Taipei Biennale, National Gallery of Indonesia, and among others. And the recent solo exhibition and the focus program has been held in Karlsruhe last year. So we will go into the recent work of their recent work later. So now I would like to maybe start with what is New Pessimism, although Stephanie mentioned a little bit, it's your film studio, but it's also kind of your philosophy, but also a platform for you and other creative that to publishing not just film, but also other kind of artistic medium, maybe music or books that I think we would love to hear more about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. The title is quite intimidating, An Artistic Guide to Surviving the Present. I'm not sure if I have that answer. But yeah, New Pessimism is an initiative that we developed, I think, 2018. Yeah, since 2018. We were, during that time, we were thinking a lot about how to have a production studio, because we are producing stuffs mostly films, and during that time also publishing. And then we try to kind of somehow also not avoid, but really have to deal a lot with Indonesian tax. So it's more pragmatic at the beginning, maybe we should kind of create this production studio. And because we also work with the same people, always the same people, the same director of photography, the same sound person, etc. So we try to kind of organize this production studio as some sort of kind of also a little bit a wealth distributions in this context. Sometimes we got funding from outside, and then we try to kind of distribute this to other people who are also, engaged in our production studio. So because most of the time it's us who produce, but sometimes, for example, our friends who also make music for us, sound design for us, he wants to make an album, and then there's no funding for this album, so he can also use the money that we get from, outside funding from our project. Basically that at the beginning, but we call this production house New Pessimism because during that time we were kind of also a little bit engaged with the political situation in Indonesia. Particularly, you are more engaged with the indigenous community. We're more with the kind of an anarchist movement and stuff. So we try to use this term New Pessimism because I'm not sure if you're familiar, but Indonesia were under military dictatorship for 32 years, since 65, 68 until 98. And in the 98, there was this kind of like a big media coverage because the Suharto, the military dictators, were toppled down by the students' movement. And there was a big headline in the media most of the time that says, a new optimism for Indonesia, a new democracy, something like that. But then it's been almost kind of 20 years or so. We didn't even feel that because a lot of people who are in power are still the military, especially these days. I don't know if you follow the news, but there's a remilitarizations of Indonesia currently happening. So we kind of like play with this word, new optimism, and using new pessimism as some sort of kind of like catharsis for us to think about like, are we still optimists with the upcoming future? And also, I guess our practice somehow show that we're a little bit pessimist, but in a funny way. Maybe you can also share about how you deal with the indigenous people.
I don't know, like, for me, new pessimism is like a motto, but it is also like a new way to pessimist, but at sometimes trying to bring up the humor in a sarcastic way. So it's a humor, I guess.
Yeah.
And I also feel like the notion of new pessimism was like very rude in your interested in all this like horror cinema, like B movie, pulp fiction, because in this kind of like media or this kind of genre that they usually portray such kind of like a sad event that people got killed or present some kind of suffering in some way, that I'm wondering how this kind of like bad like movie or bad like books, that how did they inform your practice, that how you two being inspired by this kind of like books and movie, and how it turned into like linkage with the new pessimism?
So most of my work are like inspired by the B movie and then the 80s horror and Gronggino and Indonesian electronic cinema aesthetic, or just like trashy films. Soap operas. Like, I think when I'm not really like put my mind into like, oh, I have to be like new pessimist. I'm just like finding things that I like and how what I can more enjoy to express my idea through. Like maybe with making a blob of fat as a chair. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of like, I am somehow a product of this cultural deviant, I would say, because I grew up in the rural of Bandung, not so far from Jakarta, where we don't have kind of like cinema, but we have this like itinerant cinema troupes, like the people who bring films and then show it in the field, in the market, etc. So I pretty much kind of grew up watching this kind of like films when I was a kid. And this film is usually American 80s horror, like Hong Kong, actually. Hong Kong horror. I don't know, like if you know, like a Shaw Brothers horror films, like sometimes the title is weird, like the Devil Fetus, or like, you know, yeah, or this kind of stuff. So I kind of grew up with this actually, and that's almost kind of like the kind of like a cultural product that I consume. Obviously, it's very pessimistic, this kind of films, because it's also, I guess, it's also the zeitgeist during that time that especially with American horror film, it was the the declining of economy, and then you have this kind of ghosts and everything, or killers or murderers to kind of like somehow showing or represent that. And as in Indonesian cinema is also a product of a propaganda machine, because the horror films was mainly actually made by the states through like a approval of the states. So that's kind of like maybe the aesthetics that I'm using, but at the same time, I also grew up with science fiction literature, and that's almost kind of like my escapist as well, science fiction literature. And growing up in the rural area where also extractions and industrializations was happening, it's almost kind of like those kind of stuff that mix with my interests of horror, the pessimistic tones of this genre, cinema and literature.
Yeah, so I feel like in your practice, we can see so many influence like from those like inspiration you just mentioned, that I would like to maybe move to the exhibition that we did in Eaton, because like, which is the first time you work like a exhibition under the group of like new pessimism, that I'm wondering that like after years each other and working on, I would say, similar aesthetic, that why like in 2018 you think of like started apart from the text thing about, so how's the exhibition come up, how do you like think of choosing this work in the exhibition that under the framework?
In 2019 I wanted to make a book, a cockroach book, and then Riar is like the sponsor.
Investing
in but we don't have the name of the publication, so it's just coming up into our mind like New Pessimism, and then after that we only make another book. I think for
a son of a friend.
Yeah, for a son of a friend during pandemic.
During pandemic, we kind of like published a book because our friends were having a hard time, but her son was making a comic, so we published this comics, and then all of the money we get, we kind of contribute to the family.
Yeah.
But for the show in Eaton, I guess we select films and works that somehow potentially
I think
could be censored in Indonesia.
And also we never work as a collective because we work individually, but through the exhibition it feels like, through you, from your curatorial, it becomes like a sort of movement, probably.
Yeah, I guess when we decided to do this show, was it 2023, right? Yeah, it was based on this conversation that some of our works cannot be shown in Indonesia, especially the cockroach work.
Yeah, most of my work is, not most of my, one of my work is cannot be shown in Indonesia. So also Riar's work, and then that's why we try to make a show that is impossible to do in Indonesia.
Yeah, which is funny because it's possible in Hong Kong, but then actually the political situation, it's kind of like also a way for us to kind of like having these conversations about how to resonate what is actually happening, all the censorship that happened in Indonesia, and then somehow we can show it in Hong Kong, and then in Hong Kong it's totally a different context. But if you look into like past this kind of context of like geographical context, is actually also resonate to Hong Kong. I guess that's kind of like our conversation to have this show in Eaton, which is quite funny because was it like reviewed as the weirdest like exhibition?
Yeah, probably the weirdest exhibition in that art week.
Yeah.
Because like personally, I really like the subject that you explore. That usually is like some kind of being was being like marginalized or objectified, that people hate it so much. Like we are afraid of cockroach, we are afraid of like cannibalism. This kind of like concept may be too crazy for people, but actually they are just like being like marginalized in some way. That so I'm curious, like how do you feel about the censorship, like in like not just Indonesia, because you face in other country, right? But as long as like in our space, that we just want to let the artist do his own thing or her own thing, and let the artistic freedom like comes in our gallery. So apart from the cockroach and apart from the cannibalism, maybe you can share a little bit like other experience you had with the censorship.
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess as an Indonesian, even though we pass all of the military dictatorship, and then we kind of like a generation that grew up in between of military dictatorship and so-called democracy, but censorship are still strong. Last year, actually the piece I show in Eaton, it's about this anarchist group and stuff, was also not censored, but like there's a 3 military personnel came to see the show, and then they take pictures and stuff, because they were like, it was a show about anarchism, and anarchism in Indonesia is kind of like even considered terrorist group. So there was a thing, but I tried to push it in the show to not like, cancel it and whatnot. And apparently it's fine, like there's nothing happened, but like having a military personnel inside the art space, it's kind of like also for me a bit traumatic experience. And then what is also, well, with this kind of like new, I don't know if you follow the news, but there's a new law in Indonesia that basically kind of like wants to bring back this double functions of military as a law enforcement, not law enforcement, but as a military, but also at the same time to have a civic position. That kind of like a bit scary for me personally. So now I'm trying to kind of like also, as the title suggests, to survive the present and to think about like how to actually organize when everything. Well, luckily for the last 7 days there was a massive protest in Indonesia, kind of like against this idea of the new law. But if this is happen and implemented, then we have to think about like how to play the game again, because then the military could be in the position of a cultural, and that's already kind of like somehow have some big impact to us. For example, some of my project already canceled because we're supposed to get like funding from the government, but then the government says, oh, we cut like most cultural budget. But anyway, I guess this kind of like shift into the political situation to the kind of like a little bit everywhere, like it's not only in Indonesia. And then for us, we try to always kind of like playing with the game, with the censorship, including using fiction. Like fiction is big for us because that's also the thing that we somehow, can slippery, playing with censorship. And then sometimes when I produce or Natasha produce, maybe not so much Natasha, but when I produce, for example, in the extraction area, I have to create my own fiction as well, because then I have to talk about like I'm not an artist. When law enforcement came and then say, what are you doing here? I have to create this fiction as well, character even, to say like I'm a geochronologist or some like a very hard like understood like words for the military. But that's also fiction inside a fiction, like in order to practice this. Almost like a metafiction. So it's like fiction as a methodology almost, kind of. That's kind of like what maybe us trying to do.
I think for me, the censorship is not coming from the authority, but it is also coming from the society on the internet, the citizens, the netizens. Like in these current times, we live our lives like online, and then as an artist, you share your work online, and then there are nothing you can do if there's cyberbully or like people like cancel your work on the internet because as the work is it already online, so people can have the meaning like distorted or some way. So it is also hard, like to create such a safe communication, and to share your work online is also a new deal for me. Yeah, because I was like having in maybe 2017, I got like cyberbully because my work was leaked online, and it was like, it is a pure fiction, but then people just see it as it is. They didn't come to the exhibition, and they didn't know what it's all about. They just see one image, and then it's like create a disaster, I think. Yeah, and yeah, I have to deal with the cyberbullies, and then people try now used to like catch me on the street because they knew me somehow, but yeah, it was on the past. But now, I think since 2019, I start to like a pilgrimage to my ancestor, making a work with the community of indigenous people in Minahasan. It's hard, but like apa sih namanya? I have to be very careful to share what I'm doing with the community online, and then I have to be like very came like with the pure intention, not trying to extract or something, but at the same time I'm try to learning my ancestor roots, but I don't want it to be exotic, but I want to be critical, so it's a challenge.
Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about your current exhibition in the MACAN Museum, because it's also kind of like extension from like your connection with your like community in Minahasan, yeah.
Sure. So I have a current exhibition in Museum MACAN called Primate Visions, Macaque Macabre, commissioned by Audemars Piguet Contemporary. And so in this past few years, I've been working closely with Minahasan community, and then in Primate Visions, I work with all Minahasan artists. So we invite them to come to Jogja and then to do the shootings, and then also the half of the shooting is doing in Minahasan. So it is part of my long-term research where I going back and forth and live in Minahasan, and then I try to find, always try to experiment a new way to work with the community. Yeah. Also, we had the performance few days ago in here, in this room.
Maybe Riar, do you want to share about your like recent feature film that's screened in the Berlin Film Festival and also in the Grassworld?
Yeah, so we have a studio in Jogja. It's a city in the foothill of volcano, Merapi volcano. So I've been like a kind of like engaged with the people who are, you know, living in the volcano maybe since 2016, 2017. And this mostly people who are kind of like, some of them are stateless people, because the higher you get, the more people who are against the state. So I kind of like hang out a little bit with this like stateless people in the volcano who think, actually they think the volcano is God. So we kind of like we make a film together, but then we realized that actually there's another kind of like worldviews or like community who think the volcano differently. So then I started, maybe since even like 2019, I started to look into like more scientific community, like volcanologists, and also the miners who just like mine the sand there, and then sand and the rocks there, and then, you know, they don't care at all about the volcano, etc. But eventually we made this film together called Monisme, and then we finished the film in 2023, and we screened the film everywhere. But anyway, it's a film about this, it's a feature film about this kind of like dynamic between the different kind of worldviews of, you know, the scientists, the mystic stateless people, and the sand miners. But we make this film in the context of like a horror films, because when I made this film, I tried to put camera in front of people, and then they always thought that I'm a journalist, and journalism is kind of like a big, somehow it's kind of like a ghost or like almost a demon in the mountains, because sometimes journalists, they came and then they you know, they make a report, but then it doesn't, you know, bring anything. So when we were doing this project, we are actually thinking a lot about like what kind of a cinematic language that we share. And then, you know, coming from a rural, and then they're also from a rural, we actually grow up with the same kind of like horror films. So we write scripts together, we make a film together in the context of Indonesian horror films in the 80s. So yeah, the film is about 2 hours. And because of that interaction with the stateless people, I started to realize that the stateless people in the mountains, they were practicing a kind of like a different version of Islam. So Indonesia is kind of like a, you know, Muslim majority country, but apparently a lot of like the Islamic mystics, you know, like the mystics people that, so they do a practice of Islam, but it's more kind of like devotional, and it's kind of like really withdraw to the idea of you know, the world. It's kind of like it's just their connection with the God kind of thing. So a lot of the mystic people from 15th century, 16th century, they were basically marginalized by the sultanate, by the state, the idea of states, because they're practicing something that are considered blasphemous for the institutionalized Islam. So a lot of these people, they went to the mountains and they met the animist indigenous people in the mountains, and then the descendants now is the stateless mystic that I met. So they are the descendants of this like Sufis mystic from the 15th century. And I started to kind of like really look into the history of this like people who are like, you know, against the idea of state, but from this mystical religious Sufism stuff. And yeah, I made this project called Mirage. It's kind of like really looking into their practice and their history of the way they think about the world, especially because they also think about the world in a very unique, I would say, quite unique way, because one of them, for example, one of them believe that God is located in the smallest particles. And that means they already think about atom and particles in the 15th century, although the method is a bit different than science, for example. So I'm very curious about that, and I make this project, and then the project is kind of like imagining their practice based on how cinema is used to as a science communications. You know, like for example, nature documentary or like science documentary from the 70s, like Carl Sagan, Cosmos, or I don't know if you are familiar with it, but they're mostly like there's a white dude, like white scientist telling you this is the world, this is the, you know, like this is how gravity works and something like that. So I kind of like changed that into like this space astronaut of the Sufis from 15th century telling you, a woman Sufis from the 15th century telling you about how the God is located in smallest particles. So that's kind of like the project is to somehow playing with the languages of a science documentary. But also at the same time, it's also a way to critique, maybe a form of critique, how institutionalized religion and the state marginalize the other, kind of like an alternative way of thinking about the world, like these mystic people, why they were marginalized just because they are like thinking about the world differently. So it's a project that I'm currently doing it, and it's an episodic work. So the work that I show in this is the work that I show in Gasworks is the first episode, and I'm currently making the second episode for this year. Yeah.
I really feel like this kind of like indigenous people or stateless people that in their mindset that although they face such kind of like situation, it's really a survival situation. They being pushed like not treated as human, maybe dehumanized or being demonized in some way that was portrayed in this kind of like mainstream media. But you to really like study how they survival strategy, that how they survive such hard situation and how they create a laureate system. Is the whole cosmology is so different from the very rational, that Western kind of like scientific kind of way of thinking that makes your work is really fascinating to me. That I'm wondering, like, is there like any like upcoming project that you can share? Although you share the second episode, maybe Natasha can share a little bit, like any new project in the coming years.
So I'm making 3 new videos for the upcoming years. One of them is about the war veteran of people in North Sulawesi. So in one of the work in Primate Visions is an interview with war veteran from Permesta. It is more or less the war veteran is anti-Indonesia, and I would like to make a fiction of a women warrior from that era, and it is more or less like Minahasan Medusa. And then during that era also, there's lots of Minahasan people moved to Jakarta on the 50s after the war, and they become preman.
Some sort of kind of like thugs. Yeah.
Thugs. As a way to survive the big city. But then during their free time, they make bodybuilding club. So yeah, like
Thugs and bodybuilder.
thugs and
goes
bodybuilder. I'm trying to make film about the bodybuilding community of Minahasan people in Jakarta in the 50s. And to reimagine how was Jakarta, and then what kind of protein powder they use on the 50s, yeah, and then I would like to make something maybe very personal, like because I always work with this community and that, this and that. I would like to make film with my dad. It's I got really inspired by him, although we don't have a really good relationship. But I would like to talk about the mental health and then the hoarders of Asian dad, yeah, and the hyper masculinity of
The Asian dad.
an Asian dad. Yeah.
Yeah, I have this second episode, but also at the same time, I'm currently looking into since I work in the volcano, I'm currently looking into this, going back to the past, like how the Dutch colony, Indonesia was under Dutch colonial for allegedly 3 centuries, around 350 years, something like that. And during the 18th centuries, there's actually this science wars in geology. So especially how there's this a different, especially in fossils, human evolutions, because Indonesia is kind of during that time, according to a lot of Dutch geologists and naturalists, was somehow the starting point of human evolutions, because they found I'm not sure if you're familiar with the fossils of Java man, and it's like a Homo erectus. Anyway, so the war is about that because of the founding of these fossils, a lot of scientific community were kind of fighting each other to provide that in human evolution, there's this theory called monogenesis and multiple genesis. Monogenesis means that all the humans came from one single source of human, and then the multiple genesis is that in the evolutions, so let's say Indonesians, Javanese people are a different descendants from the white. So there's this kind of science war that also related to race idea, and then also to geology. So I'm currently dealing with more kind of Dutch colonial scientific idea that relates to geology and human evolutions. It's a project that I'm starting to kind of think a lot, because when I was in Volcano, I was thinking a lot more about these relations between rocks and mountains and human, because I'm curious why the mountains are considered God, for example, all this kind of stuff. So, and then I found out about the whole history of Java man and the history of geological studies in Indonesia. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm trying to develop.
Maybe last question for me, because I know you two help each other's project a lot. Maybe Riar, that you help Natasha writing a little bit the script, and Natasha help you with the graphic design. Would you consider really doing a work together under
No.
them?
No.
No,
Absolutely no.
that's a big no. No, because we will fight. That's the good. Not the good, but that's kind of when we decided to have a new Pessimism is really kind of to not collaborate actually. So, but we have all of the crew that work with us together. How many? 10? More than 10. Around 10, and they are kind of also don't want us to collaborate, because then it's kind of a bit challenging for them, because it's gonna be hard to decide. But the good thing, I guess, with New Pessimism is that we know the portion of what we should do to help each other, and that's kind of the thing that we've been doing, I guess, for now. But collaboration, I don't think that will happen.
No.
I think capitalism will end when we collaborate, for sure.
Okay, I think I would like to open the floor to the audience. I'm sure lots of you got questions want to ask Natasha and Riar. Just feel free to raise your hand, and our colleague would pass you the mic. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad first to hear that New Pessimism also apply to relationships. Then I just wanted to hear you both on, you were talking about the political aspect of New Pessimism, but both your work are concerned with the environment. In Natasha's multiple work, but especially Macaque Macabre about the preservation of yaki, and of course Riar in many projects interested in eco-terrorism or volcano and so on. And how do you see also this new pessimism in relationship to environmental situation?
I think we are not like, we're just human, and then we're going to die, and we're not like cockroach or yaki. They are more resilient than us.
Well, yeah, I mean, we will extinct.
Yeah.
We will extinct. But anyway, for us, it's like we don't have like a direct kind of like relationship with, let's say, environmental activists, but we really use a lot of like these languages of, ecology and then environmental theory in the work, because we kind of like also look into the shifting of the kind of like almost the shifting of like how Indonesia is developed. Again, we are kind of like a child of a generation in between New Order regime, the military dictatorship regime, and the democracy. And then during this kind of like period, we somehow see this massive difference in terms of like development, infrastructures, etc. So it's kind of like also having a big influence to us in the way that we look into the shifting of nature, and especially maybe Natasha, you are engaged more with the indigenous people who also kind of like protector of the forest, no?
I think the way we live now is pretty much like human is the center of the ecosystem, and then through my artistic practice, I try to see the world not in anthropocentric way. Maybe it's not possible. It's like another like pessimistic feeling, but yeah, it's just an attempt.
Yeah, and also
through work, through artistic practice.
And also from my side is like I kind of like I'm kind of like really into the idea of the aesthetic of refusal or withdrawal. Like people who actually try to even withdraw from society, and then, not like the eat, pray, love type of like withdrawal, but more like really hardcore, like, I'm against of technology. That's why I was even working with the eco-terrorists, like the anarchist eco-terrorists, because they were like, let's bomb some ATMs, let's bomb some nuclear facility. That's kind of like idea for me that compelling in the context of like why they're so afraid of technology. And I realized it was also a reaction to kind of like this shifting of a transitional shifting of developmentalism. And again, in Indonesia, where under military dictatorship, for sure, we have maintain the development, like infrastructures, etc. But also we have a decline in democracy, and then also decline in humanity, like human rights violation, etc. was like much more hardcore. At the same time, the economic development is, really inclining, really rising. So this is a questions that I'm interested in these relations of ecology and withdrawal, like how we kind of like organize or somehow navigate our life when the change is like really accelerated. And then, living as an Indonesians, also I don't know, when Natasha will tell me about like how, for example, the indigenous community, how they protect the forest, that's quite interesting, because that's also at the same time, you cannot say that's in an aesthetic of refusal, because they're actually protecting things that they're already living in, but also it's an aesthetic of rejections of like this state want to extract their land. So I'm interested also in that kind of dynamic, and obviously that relates to like how we think about environmental today, and the questions of ethics, especially in environments. And then I think the questions of ethics, we do filming and everything in the ethical reason, but our work kind of like not in black and white situations, because For example, I work with an actual eco-terrorist who bombs ATMs. So that's also like raising these questions of, ethics. But again, it's really related to like this transitional and then transformations of an environment and then the world that we live in. Yeah, I hope that answer.
Anyone want to like share, not just question, anything, comment? Yeah.
Well, thank you for such an inspiring discussion. Well, my question is sort of related to Riar's response in terms of using technology, because we as filmmakers, we use technology to make films, but at the same time, all these technologies such as video cameras or drones and recording technology, they all have sort of extractive history attached to it. So how do we critically reflect on the technologies we use while exploring new critical approach in activating its critical capacities, such as myth-making, etc.? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I actually have a work about that called Kasiterit from 2019, and it was actually a rethinking of technology, especially screen-based technology, that is actually heavy on the production and extraction of tin metals. And tin metals, it was the tin metals from Indonesia. Indonesia was one of the biggest exporter of tin metals in the world, actually the second after China. And this tin metals was used mostly by a company like Apple and Samsung, etc., who made their technology based on screen-based technology. So we actually went to the island of Bangka, where this tin metals was extracted in 2018? 2000, when it was in 2018, to see like really the actual mining process, and we filmed that, and then we kind of like looking into like this again, the transformations of that landscape, and then we even trying to see like how the people are reacting to like this massive extractions of tin metals in that island. And I made these films and also a installation. So this films was like an 18 minutes films. It was narrated by AI named Natasha, because she's the one who kind of like voice over, cheap labor. And the AI were well, it's a fiction. So then the AI was thinking when at some point AI reached this capacity of having become a sentient, that's kind of like the first thing that they will think about when something becomes sentient is where they come from. So then this AI are questioning like where they come from, and then they look into this island based on the film that we do, thinking about that actually their entity was made of this tin metal. So then tin metals is their ancestor, is the AI ancestor, and the film is kind of like really exploring these relations of this. Circulations of tin metals in the planet in relations to technological development, not only AI, but also screen-based technology, and then green renewable energy, because the solar panel that is used for solar energy is basically made out of thin plates. So that's something that I try to actually also looking cinema very critically from the perspective of materiality that actually creates the cinema, which is so much related to the extractions. And the extraction in Indonesia also really related to how the state is operated. So it's kind of like how to link this kind of like a different actors in the player in the world of a screen-based image making production. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question. Thank you so much. It relates a little bit to, obviously Indonesia is like the world's largest archipelagic state, right? So Riar, you talk about this in terms of the intersecting worldviews that you engage with is from the ground up, which is the indigenous worldview, let's say, and then the top down, which is the state, and everything in between. And it made me think about Macaque, who's an Ainu artist who was performing the other day. And she said something about the term decolonization. And she said that actually when people say decolonization, they're coming at it from a colonial mindset, because you're saying that you have to undo something that has been imposed, let's say. And she's much more interested in this question of indigenization, which I think both of you obviously look at in your work. And Riar, you place it within the sort of fragmented whole that is Indonesia, which could be a microcosm for the world in a way, right? Just this complexity and intersecting worldviews that are sometimes oppositional. So I wonder, if that doesn't, like what Macaque said, if that resonates with you, to both of you.
Yeah, we also sometimes have a problem with this term decolonial. The problem being that sometimes it's kind of like sometimes it's a little bit more aesthetic terms rather than having a kind of like real political engagement. And then especially, I guess when you were working with the indigenous community, they don't even use they use, right, the term decolonial today?
Not everyone is agree to use the term of decolonization, but in my previous research, I was using the word like situated knowledge, and then the illogical reasoning.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of like maybe resonate with that statement in the context that I think, it's also very hard to think about Indonesia because, 720 something languages, and every archipelago have their own ethnicity, and it's islands have its own ethnicity, and that connection is actually like quite complex. And then maybe one indigenous group they call themselves like, we're doing this decolonial work, but then maybe Natasha will kind of like encounter a different indigenous group they said like, no, we are more kind of like wants to be more kind of post-colonial situation. Post-colonial situation in this context is that, after the World War II, there's this nations, like the Bandung Conference and more about like this nation who created this solidarity in different area. They're more like having this romantic relationship with this idea because the founding fathers, founding parents were kind of like really having this idea of unifications of the archipelago. And they're more romantics to that idea rather than like really the indigeneity, I would say.
Yeah, and also the place Minahasan used to be the 12th province of the Netherlands. So we have strange relationship with the colonizer. Sometimes we feel like the government is the colonizer. Yeah, I
mean, Indonesian state is also still colonized the eastern part of Indonesia, like the Papua and then some area. But yeah, that's really funny because during World Cup, you can see some of the province in Indonesia where they support the Dutch team, like hardcore. When the Dutch team won World Cup or Euro, I don't remember, when they have a party in the street. So I think it's kind of hard it is kind of like, symbolize the world, I would say, like a microcosm of the world because it's so different ethnicity, etc. And there's also this, like, I would say it's kind of like political jingoism of united in diversity and stuff like that. But to be honest, Indonesia is still Java-centric, and this logics of Java-centric that is actually kind of like giving there's so much, not giving so much, but it's kind of like almost limit political imaginations of other islands, which eventually, there's a lack of discussions in different kind of like communities, indigenous communities. Just recently we had the, for example, Aman, what is that in English?
Indigenous People Alliance.
Yeah, just recently we have Indigenous People Alliance, and then I think conversation in terms of like really building this connection are starting now. And to be honest, to kind of like react or to, going back to your point, at some point, I think we resonate with this idea of the indigeneity rather than the colonial, because the indigeneity also something that comes up from the, let's say, the people itself, you know. But then again, the meaning of indigenous is a bit different in Indonesia, right?
Yeah.
Because it's there's two meanings. One is like masyarakat adat, which means more like a customary citizen, customary society, and the other is pribumi, which is have a very strong racial kind of like tension, because it's actually a bit anti-Chinese Indonesians, because it's kind of like we are the from the roots kind of like people. So it's I would say it's a bit complex, but I will resonate with the indigeneity more thing. Yeah.
Yeah, so we are forced to speak in Bahasa Indonesia whilst we have so many different languages. And then if we cannot speak Bahasa Indonesia, and then there will come a term of kampungan.
Yeah, like from village.
Yes.
But it's also very complex, because then Indonesian language is also the one that unified the whole nation, quote unquote, because it's like a made up languages that is not come from specific ethnicity. So it's like, it's not in the USSR or like in the Soviet that you have to speak Russia, for example, but it's like Indonesia, it's more like a Malay, based on like a Malay traders language, which is like more kind of like street languages. That's why it was strong to unify the nation. But anyway, we have a problem with nations anyway, with the like with the states. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone want to maybe share or ask the last question? Okay, if you're just too shy, that you can just like catch the artist like after this, yeah, and talk to them like privately. So I would like to thank like Natasha and Riar for this like nice conversation, and also thanks Stephanie and the Art Basel team for like invite us to doing that. Thank you.
Thank you.